There is a question that follows Nora Vetch like a coat she cannot take off. One that was asked first by her neighbor Dale Pruitt in the third week of October. Asked again by the county extension agent in November. Repeated by her brother-in-law over a pot of bad coffee in December. And murmured by 4 different men leaning against the fence at the sale barn before Christmas. The question was always the same, and it was always delivered in the same patient, slightly wounded tone of a person explaining arithmetic to someone who has already gotten it wrong twice. The question was this: why would you feed that to an animal you wanted to keep alive? Nora never answered it the same way twice, and mostly she did not answer it at all. She would look at the speaker for a moment, nod once, and go back to lifting the ear corn out of the wagon bed, one 5-gallon bucket at a time. The buckets were heavy. The corn was ugly. It had come off a field east of town that a young couple named Harstad had given up on, after a wet August rotted the lower third of every cob on the place. The Harstads had pulled what they could, piled it in a grain wagon under a tarp, and then called around looking for anyone who would haul it away before the county inspector came to take a look at the drainage situation. Nora had driven out to see it on a Tuesday. She had pulled back the tarp, picked up 3 ears from different parts of the pile, turned each one in her hands, smelled it, pressed her thumbnail into the kernel rows to check for give, and looked at the Harstad's dog, who was sitting at the edge of the wagon watching her. She paid them $68 for the load, which came out to roughly $1.70 a bushel, and she borrowed Dale Pruitt's flatbed trailer to haul it home, even though she knew what Dale was going to say when she returned the trailer, which he said, which was, "Nora, that corn is not safe." She said, "I know it." She backed her truck into the barn and started unloading. The aphorism she had written on the inside cover of her record ledger that fall, copied from a sentence her grandmother used to say while sorting through windfall apples in the cellar, was this: "What looks ruined can still have a use, but only if you know what you are looking at." She had written it in pencil and then gone over it in ink because pencil smudges, and she intended to look at it often. She looked at it that Tuesday night, and she looked at it many nights after that. The ledger itself was not her grandmother's, though it was old. Nora had started it herself 16 years earlier when she bought her first 8 ewes from an estate sale in Pemberton County. It had columns for births, deaths, weights, prices, feed inputs, and a narrow right-hand margin she used for notes in a handwriting so small and dense it required a magnifying glass to read, which is how she liked it. By the fall in question, she had 41 sheep, 1 ram, and 2 guardian dogs, and she had been running them on the same 140 acres for 11 of those 16 years. She knew the place the way a person knows a recurring dream, knew where the ground went soft in March, knew which fence posts had given everything they had and which ones were still good, knew which ewes lambed easily and which ones needed watching. She was 51 years old. She had been widowed for 6 years and had no debt except a small equipment note that she had been paying down at twice the required amount since the spring. She did not attend church, but she attended to things with a quality of attention that resembled prayer. The county extension agent's name was Marcus Tilton, and he was 34 years old and had a graduate degree in agricultural science and a manner that was helpful and direct and genuinely kind in a way that Nora found, on reflection, harder to absorb than open contempt would have been. He stopped by in the second week of November in his white pickup with the county seal on the door, and he walked through the barn with her, and he looked at the corn, and he looked at the ewes, and he wrote several things in a small notebook, and then he sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and explained with care and detail and clear diagrams drawn on the back of a county pamphlet that the mycotoxin load in severely weathered corn could suppress immune function, reduce reproductive success, and compromise the overall resilience of a small ruminant flock over a 6-month feeding period. He said he was not there to tell her what to do with her own animals. He said he wanted her to have complete information. He left 3 pamphlets on the table and shook her hand with both of his and drove away. Nora sat at the table for a while. She looked at the pamphlets. She looked at the ledger open beside them. Then she went back to the barn. What Marcus Tilton did not know, because there was no reason he should have known it, was that Nora had spent the previous 7 weeks doing something that did not appear in any county extension bulletin or agricultural science curriculum. She had been feeding the corn. She had been feeding it deliberately, systematically in measured ratios she had worked out from the records in her ledger, and from a practice her grandmother had described once in the course of a long afternoon, and which Nora had written down that same evening in a notebook she had kept since she was 19. The practice was old. It did not have a name that Nora knew of. It amounted to this: a small and carefully calibrated daily exposure to what might otherwise overwhelm, given over long enough time and at low enough levels that the body learns the thing before the thing arrives at full force. Her grandmother had called it making friends with trouble before trouble comes calling. Nora had bracketed that phrase in her notebook with 2 small asterisks, the way she marked things she intended to return to. She had not started the corn immediately. She had spent September and most of October testing. She pulled 4 ewes out of the main flock. Ewes she considered her strongest, most adaptable animals. And she ran an 8-week feeding trial on her own, without telling anyone, recording weights and coat condition and manure character and appetite scores every 4 days in the right-hand margin of the ledger in her small ink handwriting. The ratios she started with were conservative: 5% weathered corn by weight in the daily ration, mixed with good second-cut hay and a mineral supplement she had been using for 3 years. She increased the percentage on a schedule she had designed herself, working backward from what she expected the winter to require and forward from what the trial animals could tolerate. At week 6, all 4 ewes were eating the full transition ration with no visible sign of distress. Their weights were steady. Their wool was coming in dense. She noted all of this, and she brought the main flock onto the program in the first week of November, 2 days before Marcus Tilton arrived with his pamphlets. What looks ruined can still have a use, but only if you know what you are looking at. She did not tell Marcus Tilton about the trial. She thanked him for the pamphlets. She put them in the ledger drawer where she kept documents she had read and considered and decided not to act on. Her brother-in-law was a man named Pete Vetch, her late husband Clem's youngest brother, who farmed 320 acres of row crops 20 miles north, and who had strong opinions about most things, including sheep, which he considered a marginal enterprise for marginal operators in a beef and corn county. Pete came by in mid-December to drop off a box of things that had belonged to Clem, items Pete's wife had found in the back of their storage building, a project she had been meaning to complete for years. He stayed for coffee, and he looked through the barn door at the feeding pen, and he asked about the corn, and Nora told him where it had come from, and he set his mug down and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and genuine sorrow. He said, "Nora, Clem would not have done this." She said, "I know he wouldn't." She poured him more coffee, and he left without finishing it. The person who did understand was a young woman named Sable Oruel, who showed up on a Saturday morning in late November with a hand-lettered signs she had taped to the door of the feed store in town, asking for seasonal livestock work. She was 23, had spent 2 years on a research station in the high desert before her funding ran out, and had a quality of observation that Nora recognized the first morning they worked together. Sable watched Nora weigh out the rations without saying anything for a long time. Then she said, "You are using it as an adaptive stressor." Nora looked at her. She said, "That is what I am calling it." "Yes." Sable asked if she could read the trial records, and Nora handed her the ledger, and Sable read the relevant pages in the right-hand margin, standing at the barn workbench in the November cold, holding the magnifying glass, turning the pages carefully. She did not say anything else for another hour. Then she said, "What do you want me to do first?" Nora said, "Start with the water." They worked together from that Saturday through the end of April. Sable moved into the small back bedroom in the second week of December because the drive from town was unreasonable in bad weather, and Nora had not asked but had changed the sheets and put a lamp on the nightstand, which amounted to the same thing. They did not talk much beyond the work, but they ate dinner together most evenings, and Sable asked questions about the ledger, the way a person reads a book they cannot put down, one careful page at a time. She asked about the 8 original U's, about the years when things went wrong, about the notation system, about the 2 asterisked phrases. Nora answered the questions in the same plain way she answered everything. The bond between them was established entirely through the work and the records and the shared quality of attention they brought to both. December passed, and January came in cold and dry, the way it sometimes does in that part of the country, a cold that does not announce itself with wind, but simply sits down on the land like something that has decided to stay. The ewes were cycling through the transition ration with no visible distress. Nora logged their weights every 10 days. The numbers held. The ram was healthy. The guardian dogs were fat and alert and patrolled the perimeter fence on a schedule that seemed to be entirely their own invention. Sable had started keeping her own parallel notes in a small orange notebook she carried in her vest pocket, recording observations that complemented rather than duplicated Nora's. And at dinner, she would read them aloud, and Nora would add a sentence or two to the ledger, and sometimes change a number based on what Sable had seen. The 2 record systems became one record kept in 2 places, across the county and in the counties north and east of Nora's land. The winter was proceeding in the conventional way. Ranchers and small flock operators were working through their hay stores at a rate that the dry autumn had made uncomfortable. The corn prices had been soft through the harvest, and the basis had not cooperated, and several operators who had planned to sell stored corn to finance their hay costs were finding the math did not pencil the way they had expected. The man whose operation sat largest in the local imagination was a cattle producer named Gary Sondergaard, who ran 350 head of commercial cow-calf pairs on a well-maintained spread 6 miles south of Nora's land. Gary Sondergaard was not a man who talked about finances, but he was a man who talked about management, and his preferred setting for this was the coffee counter at the implement dealer in town, where he held a kind of informal court on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and where the conversation about Nora Vetch and her moldy corn had reached him before the end of October. He had not gone to see her. He had no reason to, but he had said in the hearing of enough people that it made its way back to her, that he felt sorry for anyone who had gotten that desperate, and that, in his experience, sentiment about an animal and good judgment about an animal were 2 entirely different things that people with small operations tended to confuse. Nora heard this report from Dale Pruitt, who delivered it with the air of a man who believed he was doing her a kindness by telling her. She said, "All right." She went back to the barn. In the third week of January, Nora finished a calculation she had been working on in the right-hand margin of the ledger for 2 weeks. The calculation concerned the expected body condition of her flock at the midpoint of a longer-than-average winter, set against the expected body condition of comparable flocks on conventional winter rations, given a specific range of stress scenarios she had listed vertically in the margin in order of increasing severity. She showed it to Sable at dinner. Sable read it and then read it again. She said, "This is the version where they are all right." She pointed to the lowest row of the table. She said, "What is this one?" Nora said, "That is the version where it does not stay dry." Sable looked at her. Nora said, "February is what I am thinking about." Sable nodded and said nothing else. They finished dinner. Nora wrote the date in the ledger and closed it. The signs that preceded what came in February were not dramatic. They were the kind of signs that are only legible if you have been taught to read them and have been reading long enough to trust the reading. The lichen on the north-facing fence posts had a particular density and color. The guardian dogs were sleeping closer together than usual. The ewes were eating in a pattern that suggested increased baseline caloric demand. Nora noted all of this in the ledger on the 1st of February, and she wrote in the margin, in her small inked hand, 2 words, "It is coming." She did not specify what it was. She did not need to. She and Sable spent the next 4 days doing the final preparations, which consisted of bringing the remaining hay supply entirely under cover, checking and reinforcing 3 sections of windbreak fence on the northwest exposure, filling every available water vessel against the possibility of a pump freeze, and adjusting the feeding ratios one final time upward. A preemptive move based on the cold that was coming. They finished the preparations on the 5th of February in the late afternoon and stood in the barn door for a while, looking at the sky, which was doing nothing yet, but which had the quality of a room where someone is about to speak. What came on the night of February 7th was not a blizzard in the showy sense that people describe when they want to sound as if they survived something. It was worse than that because it was quiet. It was a sustained combination of dropping temperature and freezing rain that began after midnight, transitioned to heavy wet snow by 3 in the morning, and then locked everything under a 1/4 inch of clear ice before the temperature fell another 18 degrees, and the wind came up from the northwest at a sustained 32 miles an hour for 36 hours without interruption. The ice went everywhere the wind sent it. It found the gaps in every structure in the county that had a gap to find. Water systems froze. Roads closed on the 2nd day. Power went out across 4 townships on the morning of the 8th and did not come back until the 11th. The County Emergency Management Office received 49 calls related to livestock welfare in the first 48 hours. Most of them came from operations that had been considered, by the standards of the county, well-run and well-prepared. Gary Sondergaard lost his main waterer on the night of the 7th, a system he had invested in significantly the previous spring based on a recommendation from a supplier's representative. The backup system, which was older and less sophisticated, failed on the morning of the 8th when the temperature reached its lowest point, which was 11 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at 7 in the morning. His hay storage, which was sound and dry, became inaccessible on the 2nd day, when the ice sheets loading on the east-facing roof of his hay barn pulled 3 purlins loose and brought a section of the roofing down across the main access door. He was not ruined. He was not the kind of man who could be ruined by a single event. But he lost 31 calves in 48 hours to a combination of cold stress, dehydration, and the particular vulnerability of young animals whose mothers were themselves beginning to show distress. He also lost something harder to quantify, which was the assurance he had carried for 20 years that his operation was structured against most of what the country could send. Nora's barn was not warm. It was never warm. It was weather-tight in the places that mattered and had 3 inches of bedding deep in all the pens and 2 heat lamps on extension cords plugged into the one circuit that ran off the small generator she kept fueled and tested every November. The water system had been gravity-fed from an elevated tank she and Sable had filled completely on the 5th of February. It did not freeze. The ewes were in good body condition, a consequence of 11 weeks on a ration that had been asking their systems to adapt to moderate stress, and they moved through the storm in the composed way of animals whose reserves are intact. 2 ewes showed minor respiratory signs on the second day of the storm, and Nora treated them with what she had on hand, and logged the treatments in the ledger with time and dosage. Both animals were eating normally by the 3rd day. The guardian dogs had come inside of their own accord on the first night, and were sleeping between the 2 main pens with the quiet authority of animals that have correctly assessed the situation. On the morning of February 9th, the wind dropped enough to make the yard crossable. Nora went out at first light to check the fences and the water tank, and to read the temperature from the thermometer mounted on the north wall of the barn. She was standing outside the barn door with the temperature in her head when she heard tires on the frozen gravel of her lane. The truck was familiar. It was white with a county seal on the door, and it was moving slowly because the ice on the lane was still treacherous. Marcus Tilton got out in a heavy coat and a hat pulled down over his ears, and he walked across the yard toward her. And she could see from the way he moved that something had shifted in him between the last time she had seen him and now. He stopped about 10 feet from her. About 10, he did not have his notebook. He said, "I have been going to places since yesterday morning." He stopped. He said, "I need to understand what you did here." She said, "Come inside." She made coffee, and she opened the ledger on the kitchen table, and she walked him through it from the beginning, from the purchase of the corn to the trial protocol, to the transition schedule, to the preparation work she and Sable had done in the first week of February. She showed him the right-hand margin notes and handed him the magnifying glass without being asked. He read for a long time. He asked several questions, and she answered them. Sable sat at the far end of the table and answered 2 questions that Nora directed toward her with a tilt of her head. Marcus Tilton closed the ledger carefully and sat with his hands around his coffee mug and looked out the window at the barn for a while. He said, "I am going to need to say some things to you." She said, "You do not have to." He said, "I want to." He said that he had spent 2 years in this county telling people about best practices, and he had not known about this practice, and he was not certain it qualified as a best practice in the technical sense. But he was standing in her kitchen on the 9th of February, and he had been at 14 other properties in the last 20 hours, and he knew what he had seen, and he knew what he was seeing now, and he was sorry he had left those pamphlets, and he wanted to know if she would be willing to let him bring people here. She said, "Bring them." They came over the following 3 weeks, once the roads were passable. They came in 1s and 2s, and sometimes in groups of 4 or 5, ranchers and small flock operators, and 2 researchers from the State University Extension who had heard about it from Marcus and had driven 3 hours. They stood in the barn, and they looked at the ewes, and Nora showed them the records, and Sable walked them through the trial data with the orange notebook open in her hand. Some of them asked questions in a competitive or defensive way, trying to find the flaw in the accounting. Most of them just listened. Several of them were women who ran sheep operations alone, and they listened with a particular quality of attention that Nora recognized and did not comment on. She showed all of them the ledger. She made copies of the trial pages on her kitchen printer and handed them to anyone who asked. She charged no one for this. She asked only that people who used the method keep records and send her the results, which several did, some that spring and more in the years that followed. Gary Sondergaard came on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of February when most of the ice was gone, but the ruts in the lane were still deep. He came alone. He parked at the edge of the yard and got out slowly and stood by his truck for a moment, looking at the barn. Nora came out because she had seen him pull in, and she stood on the porch steps. He walked over. He was a large man, and he looked, that afternoon, not smaller exactly, but as if something that had given him a particular quality of mass had shifted out of place and had not yet found a new arrangement. He said, "I heard you talk to Tilton." She said, "I did." He said, "I heard you let people come look." She said, "Yes." He stood there for a while. He said, "I lost 31 calves." She said, "I know." He said, "I said some things." She said, "I heard them." He said, "I was wrong about you." She said, "All right." He stood there for another moment, and then he said, "I don't know what I came here to ask." She said, "Come look at the flock." He followed her into the barn, and she walked him through the pens the same way she had walked everyone else through them, showing him the animals, explaining the records. He did not say much. When they came back out into the yard, he put his hand out, and she shook it. He said, "Can I send a man to look at your records?" She said, "Send yourself." He came back. He brought his son, who was 19, and interested in the livestock side of the operation in a way that Gary had not fully encouraged. He let the boy talk to Sable for 3 hours, while Gary sat at Nora's kitchen table and asked questions in a manner that was plainly effortful, the manner of a man who has learned a particular way of talking about agriculture over many years and is finding that some of the vocabulary does not transfer to what he is trying to understand now. Nora answered the questions plainly. She showed him the aphorism on the inside cover of the ledger, and he read it twice and said, "Where did you get that?" She said, "My grandmother." He said, "Was she a farmer?" Nora said, "She was the person who taught me to look at things." The lambing that spring was the best Nora had recorded in 11 years. 43 lambs from 41 ewes, including 2 sets of twins from ewes that had been single-birth animals throughout their breeding history. She logged each birth with time and weight, and the ewe's identification number and whether the lamb required intervention or stood and nursed without assistance. And almost all of them stood and nursed without assistance, which she noted in the right-hand margin of the ledger with a simple numeral indicating the time elapsed from birth to first nursing, because she liked to know how long things took, and because the knowing was its own form of attention. Sable Oru left in June to take a position at the State University Extension Office, a position that had been offered to her partly on the strength of a letter Marcus Tilton wrote, and partly on the strength of her orange notebook, which she had brought to an informal presentation he had organized, and which the 2 researchers from the university had found compelling enough to describe in a grant application they submitted that same spring. Before she left, she and Nora spent a full day going through both sets of records, the ledger and the orange notebook, organizing and cross-referencing them, adding a final summary section in Sable's handwriting at the back of the ledger that distilled the trial protocol into a form that could be explained to someone who had not been there for the 11 weeks of November through January. Nora read through the summary section once Sable had finished it, and made 3 small corrections in pencil, and then handed it back and said, "That is right." Sable closed the ledger and put it on the table between them, and they sat for a moment. Then Nora got up and made dinner, and they ate it. The ledger stayed on the kitchen table for a long time after Sable left, the way a thing stays in the place where it is useful rather than migrating to a shelf. Nora consulted it that fall and the fall after that. She adjusted the protocol based on the data she continued to collect and based on the results that came back from the operators who had used the method and sent her their records the way she had asked. She had responses from 22 operations in 3 counties by the end of the second year. She incorporated their data into the ledger in the right-hand margin, noting the source with a 2-letter abbreviation, noting what confirmed and what diverged from her own findings. The margins grew dense. Marcus Tilton organized a field day at Nora's farm in the fall of the second year. 63 people came. She walked them through the barn and through the records in groups of 8 and answered questions for 4 hours without stopping, except to drink from a glass of water that Sable had left on the fence post for her when she came back for the day. Driving from the university 2 hours each way, standing at the back of each group with her orange notebook open and occasionally offering a clarification in a voice quiet enough that you had to be paying attention to hear it. At the end of the day, Marcus Tilton said a few words about the method and about what the winter of the 7th and 8th of February had shown, about the difference between systems designed for visible risk and systems designed for the risk that is harder to see coming. He did not use Nora's name in this part of the speech. He used it in the part where he introduced her, where he said simply that she was the person who had done the work and kept the records, and let anyone who wanted to learn come look, and that in his experience, this was a rarer combination than it ought to be. Nora said thank you and went back to the barn. She is 61 now. The flock is smaller than it was at its peak, which is a decision she made based on what the land tells her about what it can sustain at a particular level of her own attention, and she trusts the land's accounting as much as she trusts her own. The ledger has a second volume now, started in the 5th year, the same format, same margin notation system, same aphorism on the inside cover copied over in ink. Sable Oruo has published 2 papers that acknowledge the ledger and the field trial as foundational data sources, and in the citations they appear as the work of N. Vetch, unpublished records, which is the most accurate description available. On the lane post at the entrance to the farm there is a small wooden sign that Sable made in the 3rd year, and that Nora has not moved, which reads, Vetch, established, and the year Nora bought the first 8 ewes, and below that, in letters slightly smaller but still legible from the road, the sentence that started on the inside cover of the ledger, the sentence copied from a woman sorting windfall apples in a cellar in a year before Nora was born, a woman who had lived close enough to hard things to know that ruin and use are not always different categories, only different stages of the same patient and unfinished question. The sign reads, "What looks ruined can still have a use, but only if you know what you are looking at." That is what it still says. That is what it has always said.